So what we're talking about today is the date of the New Testament, but particularly the date of the Gospels. We're talking about that because it's fairly crucial to the various different areas where people are attacking the Bible and Christianity at the moment. If you go on the internet, or if you read an article nowadays, you tend to find that one of the big characters that people are following is a chap called Bart Ehrman, and he's a useful chap in that he summarizes the different attacks that are being made on the New Testament by various critics, and I call them pop critics. They're not usually very academic, though often they're professors of this, that, and the other. Ehrman himself is a professor at the State University in America. But the first thing they say is, well, the New Testament we've got isn't the original New Testament. It's been changed by the church since it was written. And we'll perhaps look at that another time if we carry on with these sessions. There's the idea that the Christianity was very diverse, with different congregations believing different things. Each of them produced its own books, and that the books we've got on were selected later on by the church to fit their particular views. The obvious connection is they didn't choose very well then, did they? But nevertheless, that's what is going out. So it's the question of what books should be in the New Testament, what books shouldn't. There's the idea that the books of the New Testament weren't written by apostles or by the people that it's asserted wrote them, but by other people much later on who were pretending to be apostles, and so that really they're forgeries. And there's the idea that the accounts of Jesus in the gospel are the result of a kind of Chinese whispers, telephones in America, process where people told stories to one another, and the details got changed. In fact, the whole stories became almost unrecognizable before they were written down in the Gospels. Those are the four different main attacks on the Bible, or on the Gospels at least. The main area where people are interested is the Gospels. But crucial to all of those is the question of when the Gospels were written. Were they written close to the time of Jesus? Were they written a long time afterwards? If they were written close to the time of Jesus, then people wouldn't have had much time to change the stories. Not only that, there'd be people who were alive who'd actually seen the events, who will be able to say, well, that's wrong if something was invented. So you've got to check on it. The critical view that Ehrman espouses tends to assume that the apostles died about 10 seconds after the resurrection or after the crucifixion, and that the Bible was passed on without any intervention by them. In fact, they would live on for quite a long time, and so would be able to check what was written down if it was written within their lifetime. So that means that the dates of the Gospels was quite important. If the Gospels were written early, then the apostles would be alive when they were written, and they would be able to tell people what they'd seen, along with other people who weren't apostles but were still around, and they'd be able to comment on the accuracy. So once a gospel appeared, the apostles would be able to say, no, that's completely wrong. Don't bother with it. Wait for one which is more accurate. On the other hand, if they were written late, then the apostles would have been dead. So would other witnesses. And so the Gospels couldn't have come directly from the apostles. Matthew and John are supposed to come directly from the apostles. If the apostles were dead and these were written later, then the claims are false straight away. The apostles wouldn't be able to decide whether they were accurate or not. The apostles are now dead, so anything could get in there. That's the theory. And there'd be lies about the titles. They would be, and same with the letters, that these would be forgeries. And even in the ancient world, it was considered a bad thing to write in somebody else's name. So let's look at the dates. Now, the dating thing I've got there goes up to 200 AD. That's way after the last gospel could possibly have been written, and it goes back to the birth of Jesus. And I put a red dot at 70 AD. Things written after 70 AD would be written after the apostles weren't really available. John is supposed to have lived on until 98 AD at least. He lived on to the reign of Trajan, so there's at least one apostle there. But in 70 AD, the witnesses would be dispersed. It'd be hard to get. If you went to Nain, you'd find a ruin, whereas before 70 AD, you'd find people who remembered the resurrection of the widow's son there. So the ability to check the accuracy of gospel accounts would vanish after 70 AD. It would rapidly go. So let's look at the dates people assigned to the gospels. And so I've got Ehrman as the first one. He's actually fairly conservative for a pop critic, but notice he places everything after 70 AD, and he places John between 90 and 100 AD. He's 90 and 95, rather interestingly. It makes him, as I said, fairly conservative. If you go on to Dostan Jones, who's quite popular on the internet, and a lot of people quote his dates, he's got John maybe as late as 150 AD. And in fact, he, having put a range between 110 and 150, then treats it as though 150 was the actual date. But he pushes the evidence as far as it can go into the future, and then some on top of that. And he's very determined that nothing could be written before 70 AD. And that's the sort of date. The ones I've outlined in red here, these are people who are really just working on a consensus. They don't have any reason for their dates other than that they've talked to other people who believe those dates are about right. So as far as they're concerned, that's a consensus of the people that they know and typically read. Wikipedia is a good place for looking for consensuses, typically somewhat progressive in modern idea sources. Wikipedia looks at the more progressive sources, and it puts dates which are a bit like the ones in Ehrman. It's put Matthew and Luke a bit later, John it has a wider range, and Mark, though, is put a little earlier. And that's probably quite a reasonable consensus. If you're looking at what scholars say from F.F. Bruce onwards, they tend to have dates about around that area. Let's look now at people who actually did studies on the dates, actually look at evidence as opposed to trying to put together a consensus of the people they know. And this one is Harnack. Harnack is writing in 1897, and he's writing against a background where people believed, they were absolutely adamant, that all the Gospels were written in the 2nd or even 3rd centuries. So they didn't have much evidence. There's no Dead Sea Scrolls. There's no really early papyrus manuscripts of the New Testament around. And they are working on the ideas that doctrine developed, and they take the Protestant interpretation, typically the Lutheran interpretation of the New Testament, and they say, when did that appear? And they can see it appeared quite late in church history, and so they say, well, we got the Lutheran interpretation of the Gospels, so they must have been written quite late when these ideas first appeared in the church. And Harnack was fairly appalled by that, and from the evidence the more sober evidence he could get, he said, well, it has to be much earlier, and he is pushing things as early as he could get away with on the basis of evidence. He hasn't got much evidence for the earliest possible date, but the latest dates he could find were, well, he thinks Mark must have been written before 70 AD, Matthew maybe a little after, John must be written before 100 AD, 110 AD, because the quotations in early church fathers in that next decade. Kimmel's writing in the 1960s. The one I've got is a study which was published in 1963. And again, it's based on the data he had available. He didn't look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, but he has seen the Rylands fragment. So he knows that John's Gospel has got to be written in the 1st century. Again, he's still working against a very, very strong critical movement, and these look very early to the critics that he's writing for. And then we get a bombshell. We got John A.T. Robinson, who is writing in 1976. It's worthwhile reading his book because his method is interesting. And he suddenly places everything well before 70 AD. And he points out that, in fact, there's nothing in the Gospels that suggests a date after 70 AD for any of them. In fact, most of them don't mention the Jewish war at all. In fact, the only mention we've got is a prediction that some problem is going to come, which is the Olivet prophecy. There's detail in that, but the detail actually is fulfilled much, much later. Not just in 70 AD, but rather longer after 70 AD. So it's got to be a prediction. And he pushes everything way before 70 AD and possibly into the 40s AD. And finally, we've got Wenham, who is writing in 1992 as a reprint, second edition of 2005 or something like that. And he works on early church fathers mainly, and places Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't date John, all before 60 AD. Luke he puts between 50 and 55. Mark in the mid-40s, and Matthew probably before, well, certainly before 44, and maybe before 40 AD even, before the apostles were dispersed from Jerusalem. So it's a very early set of dates, based mainly on the church fathers. But it's quite an interesting read, is his book. My own dates, which was what I'm going to develop in a moment, are a bit later than Wenham, but earlier than the critics. And I also put the New Testament as complete well before 70 AD, at least the Gospels anyway. So there's a couple of lines just to show how they compare. So my mark corresponds to Wenham's Luke, and the latest date I have fits in about with the latest date Robinson gives for John. So let's start thinking about the evidence for the dating. The important thing is were things written before or after 70 AD, really. But fixed points. I'm going to take the resurrection as happening in 30 AD. There are actually two possibles. It could be 30 AD, it could be 33 AD. Those are the 2 years that fit the description we have in the Gospels. The difficulty for 33 is you've got to fit in the conversion of the Apostle Paul, which seems to have happened in 33 AD. So it would have to be only 6 months after the resurrection. It doesn't read like that, or it doesn't actually contradicting the idea that the resurrection is there. It could just possibly have got in, but the feeling is that it's a bit longer before Paul has his experience on the road to Damascus. 6 months seems a very short time for all the things that get in there. Other fixed points, well, the one everyone knows about is the 70 AD date in which Jerusalem was destroyed, and that was a really major event, something that isn't ignored. So any Jewish writing for the next sort of 2 decades mentions the destruction of Jerusalem as a past event. And Gospels, while you don't think of them as Jewish writings, the people who wrote 3 of them were Jewish people, originally anyway, and you'd expect them to be absolutely shocked by the destruction of Jerusalem. So the fact that it's not mentioned as a past thing suggests that the Gospels are written before then. But of course, The destruction of Jerusalem didn't happen one day. The Romans turned up and said, we'll destroy Jerusalem. It was part of a war. The war started in 66 AD and went on to 74 AD, with the final thing being the fall of Masada. So we've got an extended period. Again, you'd expect, if the Gospels were written during that period, you'd expect some reflection of it. So the suggestion is that none of the New Testament books is written during the Jewish war, and you'd expect Paul to mention it in one of his letters if he was writing during that time. I don't think he was. And of course, the Jewish war, in which Jerusalem is destroyed, is one of three. So there are two of the later wars: the Kitos War, which were no real inhabitants of Judea at the time to revolt, but all over the Middle East, Jews went into revolt against the Romans. And there's the Bar Kokhba revolt 132 to 135. And some of the pop critics find echoes of those in the Gospels, but they're very unconvincing. The other main point in dating the New Testament is the fire of Rome, which starts on the 19th of July in 64 AD and destroys about half of the city of Rome. And that's important because it's the start of the persecution of Nero. Take perhaps another 3 or 4 months for the persecution to start after the fire. Might even be as much as 6 months. But somewhere at the end of 64 AD, beginning of 65 AD, the persecution starts, and it's severe. Christians in Rome are rounded up. More are rounded up. They're put to death in a horrible way. Throughout the empire, Christianity is declared an illegal religion, and you get that kind of flavor to Christian writings later on. They're expecting persecution. The New Testament doesn't expect persecution, with the exception of the Revelation. It acts, you find that when Paul gets brought up in front of the authorities, he can appeal to the Romans for protection. That wouldn't happen after Nero's persecution started, not ever, not until 315, something like that. So we've got a background to the New Testament which seems to be much before the start of Nero's persecution. It gets mentioned in the letters of Peter. There's a persecution preparing, but it hasn't started yet. The other fixed point, which tends to get ignored, is the Edict of Claudius. Claudius has the Jews expelled from Rome, and the Roman historians tell us that because they were rioting about someone called Christus, Christos, of course, the Messiah. Now, it's quite possible that it was Jewish Christians and Jews who weren't Christians who were getting into bother with one another, or it could be that there was someone else who was claiming to be a Messiah. But we do get that as a date, and it's referred to in Acts. Paul arrives in Corinth just after the Edict of Claudius. So that helps us to date things. So we've got some fixed points. We can try and date things against those fixed points. Okay. So let's look at the reasons that the critics give for dating things late. First of all, there's the Jewish war and the Olivet prophecy. And the Olivet prophecy predicts that the temple would be destroyed and Jerusalem with it. The critics say, well, you can't have a prediction of the future, so therefore the New Testament must have been written, or at least the Gospels must have been written after the temple was destroyed. Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't have predicted it, or it wouldn't have been seen predicted. There's actually quite a bit of detail in there. And so they say it's written after the event, or the Olivet prophecy is written after the event. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke must be written after 70 AD. And they put John after those as well. Now, the interesting thing here is that it doesn't really fit very well, doesn't that idea? First of all, there's a difference between significant details and memorable details. The Olivet prophecy mentions the significant details, the things that are important for the history of mankind and for the gospel, but it doesn't mention the most memorable details. The most memorable details were the sheer slaughter, people who saw it happen, or who had access to people who knew about it, were appalled by the number of people who were killed. That was one of them. And the other one is the fire. That the temple was destroyed by fire, the city burned, and that killed more people. And that was, again, in writings after the event. That is the thing that stands out, the fire of Jerusalem and the number of people who were killed. So the Olivet prophecy doesn't read like something written after the event. It reads by something that predicts it. Now, the other point about it is that it doesn't just predict the destruction of Jerusalem in some detail. It predicts the return of Jesus in some detail. So maybe we should conclude, if we're going to say, well, it couldn't predict anything in detail, after Jesus' return, we'd have to decide that the Gospels are written after the return of Jesus. It doesn't really make that much sense. And the other thing is that there's no suggestion that the Olivet prophecy is fulfilled. If you think about the prophecy of Agabus in Acts 11 and verse 28. Look at that, Acts 11 verse 28. Verse 27 for connection. It says, in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit there will be great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So we've got a fairly minor character. Agabus turns up a couple of times, but he's a fairly minor character in the New Testament, and he produces a prophecy and it's fulfilled. And that says, look, it was fulfilled. So if Jesus gave a prophecy and it was fulfilled, you definitely expect them to put the fulfillment of that in. But there's nothing like that in the Gospels, which suggests the Olivet prophecy wasn't fulfilled at the time the Gospels wrote them down. So that's one of the reasons given, the Jewish war, and that reason doesn't really hold water. And in fact, there's no mention of the Jewish war in the Gospels, which suggests that the Gospels are written before 66 AD when it broke out, rather than before 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed. So the suggestion is that the Olivet prophecy, they're recording something delivered before 66 AD. And the fact they don't report the fulfillment suggests that the whole thing was written down before the 66 AD start to the war. Another thing they give is a thing called a Council of Jamnia. It's allegedly a council in the 80s AD. Some people put it very precisely at 86 AD. And it's alleged that at that the Jews decided that the canon of the Old Testament, and decided that Christians should be excluded from the synagogue. And so John's Gospel, 3 different references there, where it talks about people being excluded from the synagogue, and they say, well, that didn't happen till 86, the Council of Jamnia. So they say John is reflecting that in his what he's writing. So John must have been written after the Council of Jamnia. Well, there's a problem in that there's obviously a conflict between Jesus and the Jewish authorities right from the start. Jesus was crucified. He was crucified on the instigation of the Jewish authorities. He was crucified not only by Jews, but by Gentiles as well. But nevertheless, it shows there was a conflict between Jesus and the Jewish authorities. And that goes right back to the time of Jesus' ministry. You don't have to wait until some council in the 80s to exclude Christians from the synagogue. And of course, if you read the letters of Paul, you find that there's conflict between Paul and the Jewish authorities. There's conflict both ways. Before, when Paul was part of the Jewish authorities, he is persecuting Christians, and he writes about that in his letters. And later on, there's conflict between Paul and the Jewish authorities. And Paul is dead long before the Council of Jamnia. Second thing is, if you try and actually find evidence for the Council of Jamnia in Jewish writings, which is where it supposedly has its effect, you find there actually is no evidence at all of any council at Jamnia. That doesn't seem to have happened. So they're basing it on an event which never took place. And in any case, there wasn't a unified Jewish authority. Once the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem was finished in the 70 AD war, there wasn't a universal authority for Jews throughout the world. So they couldn't make a decision which was binding on everybody else in any case. It doesn't make sense. So that reason just falls over. It's just there to boost skeptical arguments, and there's no evidence. It's completely built on quicksand. And the third reason that they give is the idea of the Trinity. The doctrine of Trinity developed slowly in the early church. We can agree with that. And it doesn't appear, the earliest possible times it might appear is the end of the 2nd century. In fact, it's developing. The people who are talking about the Trinity in the end of the 2nd century would have been marked down as heretics and excluded from the church in after the Council of Nicaea. But the critics, again, they're very orthodox in many ways. They assume Lutheran theology, and they assume that the Gospel of John particularly teaches the doctrine of the Trinity. It doesn't, but they assume it does. And so they say, well, as the doctrine of the Trinity wasn't there in the early church, but it is there in John's Gospel, therefore John's Gospel must have been written late. And they say the same thing for Philippians. They say it's got a Trinitarian statement in it, so that must have been written late. And they place some of Paul's letters late on that same thing. Well, of course, we know the Gospel of John doesn't contain any Trinitarian passages. It contains passages people like to reinterpret in a Trinitarian manner, but that's not the same thing. It doesn't mean that was John's intention when he wrote them. And the same thing's true of the epistles. Well, the development of Trinitarian doctrine does come much later than the 1st century, but it isn't in the Gospels, so it doesn't affect our dating of the Gospels. So they're based their argument on a theological assumption, which is that the Gospels are much more Trinitarian than they in reality are. So that's the undermine the idea for late datings. We've got physical evidence. We've got papyri. The earliest undisputed papyrus fragment we've got is P52, the Rylance fragment. It's what's John's Gospel. Now, with these papyri, you've got to put a range on. I've put that at the middle date, but it's generally reckoned to be somewhere between 90 AD and 140, and with most likely dates somewhere around 120. The critics tend to push that back to possibly 150, but even they have to admit that a 1st century date is just about possible. And it was found in the Fayum, which is very, very rural Egypt, way off the beaten track. So the suggestion is that therefore the Gospel of John must have been copied several times before the Rylance fragment was produced. Of course, that doesn't hold for definite. Could have been a 1st generation copy, which was then much later taken to the Fayum and where it was buried. But people tend to reckon, no, it would get there fairly early on. So therefore, John is written rather earlier. Not the only papyrus. There are a whole lot of other papyri fairly earlier. There's P104 is an interesting one, because the dating they've got for that is somewhere in the 2nd century, anywhere between 100 AD and 200 AD. P90, average dating around 150, but could be as early as the Rylance fragment or quite a bit later. And we've got 2 substantial papyri. P75 has about 2/3 of John, a fair bit of Luke, and that's written considerably before 200 AD. It's highly unlikely it was written after 200 AD, but probably not long before 200 AD. And you got P66, which is an almost complete copy of John, a couple of pages missing, and it's occasionally got worn away at the corners. But that's also pre 200 AD. So we've got physical evidence which is saying it's not a 2nd century thing. The Gospels aren't written in the 2nd century. It must have been written before 100 AD. And you also get quotations in the early church fathers. The early church fathers, these are Christian writers before the Council of Nicaea. And later on, the early church decided they were Orthodox and called them church fathers. Other writers of that period who weren't Orthodox were considered to be heretics instead. And there's a set of quotations of the Gospels. So Irenaeus of Lyon quotes all 4 Gospels, and he quotes them by name. He says Matthew says, Mark says, Luke says, John says. And in fact, he says they're just 4 Gospels and names them just to add to the fun. Going a little earlier than him, they've got Justin Martyr writing about 150 AD, who quotes from Matthew, Luke, and John. Doesn't name them, but just quote from them. Polycarp, somewhere between 120 and 140 AD. Again, he quotes from Matthew, Luke, and John. Ignatius of Antioch is an interesting character. He writes a whole pile of letters to different churches. He's been taken to Rome he's a Roman citizen, so he's been taken to Rome and appealed to Caesar. He's going to be killed in Rome. And he writes on as he goes along to each church as he passes it, he writes a letter. And he also quotes from Matthew, Luke, and John. He died probably 115 AD, but possibly as late as 117. So we've got quite copious quotations from those. Those 3 books must have existed by 115-ish. And you've got Clement of Rome, who is writing almost certainly 96 AD, but certainly before 98 AD. And he quotes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not from John. So you can place those, there's others. There's a thing called a Didache, which has got quite a wide range of dates. No one's dead certain when it was written, and it's an anonymous writing, but that quotes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there's the thing called the Epistle of Barnabas. It wasn't written by Barnabas, that's for certain. It's written by somebody claiming to be Barnabas. Might have been somebody else also called Barnabas, and he quotes from the Gospel of Luke, or the writer does. And altogether, we've got a nice picture. And then finally, there's a thing called a diatessaron, which is a harmony of the 4 Gospels. Diatessaron from 4 in Greek. It's a harmony of 4 Gospels. It's a story of Jesus, and that's written by a follower of Justin Martyr, a disciple of Justin Martyr called Tatian, who is writing somewhere between 150 and 170, probably toward the earlier end of that range. And he quotes from all 4 Gospels, so they must all exist by that time. So again, put them in, and we're getting a period fairly early on. Synoptic Gospels have to be written before 96. Gospel of John has to be written before about 115 in order for them to be able to quote it. In fact, probably quite a bit before that, because there's no point in Ignatius quoting a gospel unless both he has a copy and the people who are receiving his letter have a copy. So there are plenty of copies around by this stage. Clement of Rome's quite interesting. When he quotes Matthew, the Greek he quotes is different from the Greek of Matthew, but it's clear that it's Matthew he's quoting. If you compare it with the variants of the sayings in other Gospels, he has the Matthew variation. That clear, but it's not identically worded. Suggestion is that he's actually quoting a Latin translation of the Gospel of Matthew, which has been translated back into Greek as he's sending off to Corinth. But Clement of Rome would have a Latin Gospel, which he translated back into Greek for the purposes of sending a letter to a Greek-speaking area. And that suggests not only was Matthew written by 96 AD, but it had been translated into Latin by that time. It's quite possible we've got 2nd century Latin translations of Matthew, fragments of. So let's look at the individual books. Acts of the Apostles. So the first thing is Acts 18 and verse 2. Let's look at that, Acts chapter 18 and verse 2. And it's Paul has arrived in Corinth. It says, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So we can date this edict of Claudius from later historians, and it comes in 49 AD. So early on in 49 AD, Aquila leaves Rome and comes to Corinth, and then Paul finds him there. So we've got Paul arriving in Corinth in 49 AD. It's at the end of a very long journey. It's the longest journey, the year when he traveled further than any other year that he walked in. So it's the end of the traveling season for that year. So it's going to be something like October, and Paul arrives in Corinth. And we know how long Paul stayed in Corinth. So go down the chapter of Acts 18 to verse 11. We've got Paul stayed a year and 6 months. That's in Corinth, teaching the word of God among them. Verse 12, but when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. So we've got a year and a half after Paul appears in Rome in 49 AD. You've got 51 AD when Gallio becomes governor of Achaia. And that's something we can place very nicely, because Gallio left an inscription in Delphi where he conveniently mentions the which year of the Emperor Claudius he was governor in. He mentions it by the number of times that Claudius was acclaimed a tribune. So it doesn't give an actual year, but it does give a number of proclamations, and we know when all those happened. Gallio was only governor for 6 months. Seneca, his brother, wrote rather scathingly about the fact that Gallio had not liked Corinth and had pleaded illness and come home. So we've got a fairly precise date for that, and it's 51 AD. It fits in with the 49 AD date. We can then follow Paul's travels. We know where he was. We know how long it took him to travel. We know where he spends the winter. And he gets to Ephesus. He spends quite a long time in Ephesus, nearly 3 years in Ephesus. And in 55 AD, he's about to leave Ephesus. And 1 Corinthians mentions that he's going to stay there till Pentecost. So we even know that 1 Corinthians was written between Passover and Pentecost. So that places 1 Corinthians very clearly in 55 AD. 57 AD, he's traveled around. He's been to Corinth again. He gets back to Jerusalem, and it's a we passage. It's a passage which refers to Paul and his companions as we traveled, we came in. And so he arrives in Jerusalem with Luke, and he stays there for a while in prison. He's captured almost straight away. Fairly soon after that, he's taken to Caesarea, but he's in Roman Judea for 2 years. And then he's taken off to Rome, shipwrecked at the end of 59 AD, gets one of the earliest ships out of Malta in the next traveling period. So in the spring of 60 AD, and probably fairly early spring, because there's a premium on grain. If you could get it to Rome, one of the first ships, you could sell it at a much higher price. So ships raced to get in there by that stage. And Paul arrives in Rome, and it'd be early in the year, and that's 60 AD. And then Acts ends. If you go to right to the end of Acts, Acts chapter 28 and verse 30, just read that. It says, Paul lived there in Rome 2 whole years at his own expense, and he welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. In other words, it ends when nothing happens. Now, normally you'd say he stayed there until he was released or until he was tried or something like that. It doesn't. It just says 2 years, 2 whole years. So we're talking about more or less exactly 2 years after he arrived. So we're talking early in 62 AD, and Acts just comes to an end without any significant thing. The only reason for doing that is that's when Acts was written. So that gives us a date for the writing of Acts, early 62 AD. And to back that up, Peter and Paul, the apostles, died in 65 AD. Death's not mentioned. James, the brother of Jesus, dies towards the end of 62 AD. That's in Josephus. You'd expect that to be mentioned in Acts, but it's not. And so Acts has got this picture being written early on in 62 AD. That's quite useful because it helps us to date the Gospel of Luke. So Luke's written before Acts. First verse of Acts mentions the former treatise, which is Luke. So Luke is written before Acts. It's an earlier book, an earlier writing. So Acts is written before the earliest part of 62 AD. So I'll put it in 61 AD. And we know when Luke was in Jerusalem, he went there and met James. We've got that in Acts 21 and verses 17 and 18. So Luke's met James in Jerusalem. The dates fit quite nicely. He arrives in Jerusalem. They're trying to get there in time for Pentecost. We don't know whether they got there before or after Pentecost. It's just not mentioned, but we know they were trying to get there for Pentecost. So it's around Pentecost time that Luke arrives in Jerusalem. So the gospel must have been written after that, because Luke's got to be able to collect his information. And there are a couple of quotations. 1 Timothy quotes from Luke. It says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the labor deserves his wages." Well, there are two different versions of that. There's a Matthew version and the Luke version. Jesus probably gave his saying in Aramaic, and the word he used for wages has been translated as two different Greek words, and this is the Luke version that we have in 1 Timothy, and we can date 1 Timothy to late-ish 62 AD. So again, that shows Luke already written by then, and not only is it written by then, it's accepted as scripture. So by 762 AD, Luke is written and accepted as scripture. And there's another possible allusion to Luke's gospel, the parable of the importunate widow, the unjust judge. And the widow in there, continues in supplications and prayers night and day, which is a sort of allusion there in Timothy. So that's an allusion to it, Luke 18. So it looks very strongly that Luke is written in before 62 AD. 1 Timothy is written in 62 AD. So we've got a period between 57 and 62 AD when the Gospel of Luke must have been written. John's Gospel, you can place it fairly well before 70 AD. There's an example. There is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda with 5 roofed colonnades. So first of all, it's an archaeological detail, but it is in Jerusalem. It's there now, John is writing. Well, he would know when Jerusalem was destroyed. The whole world knew it was put on the coins. Judea Capta coins went on for the next 3 emperors. So Bethesda exists when John was written, and it was destroyed in 70 AD. So John's written before 70 AD. And it doesn't mention the Jewish war at all. So it's probably therefore written before 66 AD. When's the earliest it could be written? Well, there's a reference possibly to the death of Peter. Well, it's definitely a reference to the death of Peter, but it seems to imply that everyone would know how Peter died. And, Peter would die in Nero's persecution, probably early on in Nero's persecution, and so probably in late 64, early 65 AD. So probably more likely early 65. So Gospel of John must be written after the death of Peter in 65, but before the start of the Jewish War in 66. Gives us the second half of 65 or the first half of 66. It's quite a narrow window. It must have been written. It's only a little bit more than a year, and we know John's written in that period. Matthew's actually the hardest one to date, but there's another mention of a place which is in Jerusalem. It says that field has been called the field of blood up to this day. So people still knew the name of that field when Matthew was written. Well, when Jerusalem was destroyed, the population that were left were taken away as slaves. It's unlikely they would remember the names of particular fields on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Not only that, but the Romans destroyed all the field boundaries, all the fences, hedges, anything like that were all ripped down and used. If it was stone, they were used as ammunition to fire into the city. If they were wood, they used either as firewood or to build siege engines, depending on how big the piece of wood was. So the field boundaries went, the trees are all cut down, the people were killed. It wouldn't be called the field of blood any longer. No one would remember that is what it's called. And yet Matthew says it's called that up to this time. So it must be written before the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem. And again, there's no reference to Jewish war. So we've got it before 66 AD. After that, it gets a bit more difficult. The earliest date is rather difficult to work out. Wenham says it must have been written while there were still apostles in Jerusalem, which they were dispersed when Herod and Agrippa started to persecute apostles. That's the theory. So Wenham puts it before 41 AD. But if you look at the genealogies, if you say that Luke has the genealogy of Mary, then Mary could only keep her birthright as long as she married somebody else who was also in line of succession. So if she wants to continue to call herself a daughter of David, she has to marry someone who is a son of David. So Matthew's genealogy of Joseph is very important to fulfill that particular law, so the law of the daughters of Zelophehad, which suggests that Matthew is filling in a gap in Luke's genealogy, which suggests it's written after Luke. But it's not the strongest argument, but nonetheless, there is it's at least an argument, and that would put Matthew after Luke. If Luke's written in 60 AD, then it's after 60 AD. So we've got some kind of early date for Matthew. Mark, well, we're dependent here on early church fathers for most of it. So the earliest writings about it, Papias, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, say that Mark and Polycarp say that Mark wrote his gospel from information given him by Peter. Peter went on a preaching trip, and Mark was his interpreter. And when people wanted a written record of what they had heard, Mark wrote down what Peter had told him in his gospel, adding a few extra things, a bit from his own experience, a bit from one or two other witnesses. And if you start looking at undesign coincidences, you can see that there are good reasons for putting Mark as connected to Peter. For example, when he talks about, well, I'll give some examples. You look at about the events, you find that Peter is present at just about every event reported in Mark. Anything where Peter isn't there doesn't get in, except for the women going to the tomb. That's the only exception there. And the accounts are told from the point of view of Peter. It's not quite so obvious as it is in the case of John. John's gospel very much from the point of view of John. But Peter's perspective, the accounts are told from Peter's point of view. So again, there's a connection. You get plural to singular construction. Let's give an example of that. First one, Mark chapter 1 and verse 21. So Mark 1 verse 21, it says, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue. And if you replace the they with we, you get a very vivid account of what's going on. And it looks as though Peter stood up and gave a talk. He talked about this particular event, and he said, and we came to Capernaum, and Jesus, he entered the synagogue, and Mark, not being Peter, has written it down as they. So we've got this they to he construction. And another one, it talks about the house, which to oikos, which in Greek is equivalent to talking about home. And in Mark's gospel, that tends to refer to Peter's house. Sometimes you can't track where it is, but where you can track it, it's Peter's house. Matthew's gospel also talks about the house, but that's always Matthew's house. It's a different house. So it looks as though it's talking about Peter throughout. So Peter is the source for Mark's gospel. So the patristic account does have something to back it up in terms of undesigned coincidences. Well, if you start looking about where Peter was and where Mark was, there's a very brief period in 41 when Peter and Mark could have got together and gone off on a preaching trip. But really, Peter is then on the borders of Palestine for a long time. He's in Caesarea and in Joppa, and in the area just inland from there. And Mark goes with Paul on his first missionary journey, and then off with Barnabas to Cyprus. And it's not until 50 AD that they both can get together. But at 50 AD, they could both go off and work together quite easily. But we also have some allusions to the gospel. Well, there's allusions to a gospel in Romans and in Corinthians, and some evidence is that gospel is Mark. Wenham thinks it's Luke. I think it's Mark. The reason I think it's Mark is, 1 Corinthians 7 verse 10. Paul is writing about something that the Corinthians should know comes from Jesus. Saying, give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. Now, Jesus teaches about divorce in all three of the synoptic gospels, but in Matthew and in Luke, he always talked about whether a husband should abandon his wife. The answer is he shouldn't. But in Mark's gospel, it also mentions that a wife shouldn't leave her husband. And this is the one that is being quoted in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So it looks as though the gospel that the people in Corinth should know about is the gospel of Mark. So it's a source known to the Corinthians, and it seems to be Mark's gospel. You get other references to a gospel. It's not quite so clear it's Mark in elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, in Romans, and in 2 Corinthians. These are just evidence that a gospel existed. The Corinthians knew about it rather than a direct quotation from it, but it's an allusion to the existence of such a document. Well, 1 Corinthians is written in 55 AD, in the spring between Passover and Pentecost. And Peter and Mark are not both free together until 50 AD. We saw that. So that puts Mark between 50 and 55 AD. Now, you've got to give a bit of time for Mark to write it after he's available in 50, and probably a bit of time for it to be distributed to Corinth and to Paul. So it's probably more likely, 52 to 53 or 51 to 53, somewhere like that. But we've got a picture of when Mark's gospel was written. So there's a time chart, summarize it all. We can date the letters with very great accuracy, often to a month or so. The Gospels, we have to put ranges in. These, by the way, first missionary journey, second missionary journey, third missionary journey, and Paul in prison there in Caesarea here in Rome. We've got Mark's Gospel, we just said between 50 and 55 AD, but probably not too much at the beginning of that period, probably not too likely at the end of that period. We've got Luke after Paul arrives with Luke in Judea, but before Acts is written, and so we've got it there in the late 50s or early 60s AD. We've got Matthew after Luke, so if Luke's written late, Matthew must have been written late as well, and it's probably written fairly soon after that. It doesn't show any signs of the persecution of the fire of Rome or of the Jewish war, so probably towards the beginning of that period, but it could have been written right at any time up to 70 AD, just possibly. And John's Gospel after the death of Peter, but before the start of the Jewish war, and certainly before 70 AD. Probably I'm being a little bit conservative, a little bit liberal in stretching it into the beginning of the Jewish war there. It probably almost certainly wasn't. So the point is that we have the Gospels written while the apostles were around to check their accuracy, and while there were plenty of other people who remember it. There were enemies of Jesus, there were priests in Jerusalem, there were Pharisees who had seen what Jesus did and said and could easily have challenged the Gospels had they been incorrect. Those people never did. So the Gospels look as though they're nicely early written, and we can trust what they say. And they're going to end.